Okay, we've talked extensively about the nervous system. The nervous system is a system of communication within the body, and very similar to the nervous system is the endocrine system. The endocrine system has signaling molecules known as hormones. And the main difference between hormones and neurotransmitters is hormones are released directly into the bloodstream and travel throughout the body, whereas neurotransmitters are released into the synaptic cleft and are traveling a very, 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 very small distance between, and we're talking very small, and that's not even small enough, between the neuron that released it and stimulating the downstream neuron or another cell, like say the cells of the heart, the lungs, the muscles, what have you. Once again, hormones from the endocrine system are released into the bloodstream. Because they're released in the bloodstream, that means they are going everywhere. And I realize we haven't talked about the cardiovascular system, but to be sure, the blood that flows through the cardiovascular system flows throughout the whole body, which means hormones are going to travel throughout the whole body. And to be clear, these hormones are not going to impact every tissue and every cell that they encounter along their route throughout the body. It's going to be heavily dependent upon receptors. So if cells have receptors for specific hormones, then they are going to be reactive to those hormones. If they do not have the receptors, it's going to be immaterial to those tissues and cells. So if we look up here, hormones do a whole host of things within the body. And to be clear, our body would be in a world of hurt without a lot of these hormones or many of these hormones. Hormones are responsible for growth and development of the body at different stages. Growth could be during repair of certain body parts. It could occur during normal maturation of the organism, the human organism in this case. Certainly sexual maturation is a huge part of hormones that we'll talk about. Behavior is intimately tied to our hormones. Reproduction, we'll talk about. The gonads, the ovaries, and the testes release hormones, estrogen and testosterone respectively. Metabolism is any chemical reaction in the body. Anabolic reactions are reactions that build up things. Catabolic reactions break things down. And a lot of these metabolic reactions are contingent upon the release of hormones to catalyze these processes to get going. And concentrations, and I realize that seems somewhat out of place here, but we need adequate levels of fluid and water within our extracellular fluid and intracellular fluid, and certainly adequate levels of electrolytes and solutes. So, for example, sodium, we need a high concentration of sodium in the extracellular fluid, and that's really dependent upon the ratio between the water and the sodium. So the endocrine system certainly plays a part in regulating water reabsorption, water excretion from the body, and certainly it's going to play a part in regulating sodium. And not just sodium, all ions and a lot of molecules within the extracellular fluid. So along our journey in discussing the endocrine system, we're going to talk about a number of things. One is class of hormones. And hormones are very similar to neurotransmitters in that they can be made out of proteins or polypeptides. A polypeptide is a smaller protein. And the great majority of our hormones are protein or polypeptide hormones. Like neurotransmitters, we also have steroid hormones. Steroid hormones are released from the adrenal cortex, from the gonads, from the testes and ovaries, and also from the placenta during pregnancy. And then tyrosine-based hormones, which are very similar, dare I say, identical to the tyrosine neurotransmitters released from neurons. Tyrosine-based hormones are epinephrine and norepinephrine, primarily epinephrine, but we include norepinephrine in that as well. The onset of hormones, that is to say, when they actually take effect in their downstream target organs, is highly variable. Certainly, the hormones need to travel to those downstream tissues, but the traveling to the tissues doesn't really take that long. But hormones like epinephrine and norepinephrine almost take effect immediately, let's say within minutes. Other hormones like thyroid hormone released from the thyroid gland and growth hormone released from the anterior pituitary may actually take days for onset. It takes time to activate those cells to elicit the appropriate cellular response that the hormones are trying to achieve. The amount. Hormones are released at very, 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 very small concentrations, as small as 1 picogram per milliliter of the extracellular fluid. A picogram is 10 to the negative 12th. A picogram is 1/millionth of a millionth of a gram. So it's a very, very, very small quantity. Feedback. Negative feedback and positive feedback play a huge part in the endocrine system. Negative feedback shutting off the whole system when our body has achieved the intended response from the cells and tissues that those hormones are acting upon. But we also have positive feedback, and we've talked about positive feedback with hormones when we were talking about oxytocin and uterine contractions, where the stretch of the cervix elicited the release of oxytocin from the posterior pituitary gland that caused the myometrium to contract, push the baby's head against the cervix, cause the cervix to stretch again to release more oxytocin and more oxytocin. That is positive feedback. And we'll also look at more positive feedback examples when we look at estrogen and other hormones related to the female reproductive cycles. And then timing of hormone release. It could be seasonally, or it could even vary within a day, in the morning versus at night, during sleep, or different stages of development within the human life cycle. One thing I do want to point out about hormones are, once again, released into the bloodstream and they travel through the blood. The blood is primarily water. Steroid-based hormones do not want to be around water, and actually, as a result, they will need some sort of transporter or plasma protein to get them through the blood, and we'll talk about that as we move forward. When we are talking about the endocrine system, what are we talking about? So if we're talking about the cardiovascular system, I think it's fairly intuitive. Now, to be clear, no instructor, teacher, professor should ever really use the word intuitive, because if things were intuitive, in my opinion, we would not need to be taking these classes or watching these YouTube videos. But something like the cardiovascular system might be a little bit easier to understand, that it involves the heart, blood vessels. The nervous system involves the brain, spinal cord, nerves. But the endocrine system is somewhat an elusive concept to understand. And there's reason for that, because so many organs in the body play a part in the endocrine system. And all that needs to happen for an organ to be considered part of the endocrine system is if they release a signaling molecule into the blood. Signaling molecules traveling through the blood are hormones. So we've talked about the pancreas. The pancreas secretes insulin and glucagon. Both of those are released from the pancreas directly into the bloodstream. They are hormones. They're regulating blood glucose levels. Insulin is going to be released during high blood glucose levels, and glucagon is going to be released during diminished blood glucose levels. The hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, which are in the brain, are a huge part of the endocrine system, and they don't impact the entirety of the endocrine system, but they impact a lot. So we'll be talking about the hypothalamus and pituitary gland extensively. The gonads, as we mentioned, the testes and ovaries, in addition to being part of the reproductive system, are parts of the endocrine system, because estrogen and testosterone released from the gonads flow directly through the bloodstream. But in blue here are a number of tissues and cells that many of us may not necessarily consider part of the endocrine system, but they are, because they release signaling molecules directly into the bloodstream. Adipose tissue releases leptin, which is involved with appetite. The stomach releases gastrin, which is involved with digestion. The heart releases ANP, which is atrial natriuretic peptide, which is released during times of high blood pressure. The liver releases angiotensinogen, which is involved in a process known as the renin-angiotensin system, and that's aimed at increasing blood pressure when there is hypovolemia or hypotension or low blood pressure. Skin releases vitamin D3, and this is a somewhat long process that actually starts in the skin via the sunlight and then is finished within the kidneys and the liver. but vitamin D3 is absolutely necessary for calcium absorption from our intestines. So lack of sunlight means we're not going to be able to develop vitamin D3. So sometimes individuals who don't get enough sunlight have deficiencies in calcium because they're not absorbing the calcium. And we'll talk about that more as we move forward. And the kidneys release hormones as well. EPO stands for erythropoietin. You may have heard EPO if you've ever heard about any of the news about cycling, endurance cycling, where athletes take EPO to increase their red blood cell counts. EPO, erythropoietin, is a natural endogenous signaling molecule or hormone released from the kidneys. There is synthetic EPO that people take as well. And renin is also parts of this angiotensinogen system. So I'm not going to get into that now because we will talk about that extensively. But without further ado, let's look at female reproductive biology and female development because they are intimately tied to the endocrine system. Here's an image of the brain, and my take-home message here is that the location of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. We've talked about the pituitary. There's the front part of the pituitary, which is known as the anterior pituitary, and the back of the pituitary is known as the posterior pituitary. In a subsequent video, we'll get into greater detail within the pituitary, but the pituitary is right here, this little black pea-sized circle right here, which extends from a region within the brain, specifically within a region known as the diencephalon. That region is the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are major players in the endocrine system, and they release hormones known as tropic or trophic hormones that stimulate the release of other hormones. So with regards to female physiology, the endocrine system plays a huge part, and it's unfair to say that it doesn't play a huge part in males, but it's probably more elaborate within females, and it's heavily involved in pregnancy. And since males don't engage in pregnancy, we're going to talk about females here. So just to talk about female anatomy to get things so we're all on the same page, this right here is the uterus. Descending from the uterus right here is the vaginal canal. Coming off laterally from the uterus, we have the fallopian tubes. And in blue right here are the ovaries. So within the ovaries are where the eggs or ova are developed. Eggs or ova are female gametes. The male gametes are the sperm cells. But during pregnancy, an egg is fertilized by a sperm cell, developing a zygote, an embryo, a fetus, and then a cute little baby. A female, when she is born with all the eggs she's ever going to have, or really all the eggs she's ever going to need. And those eggs develop within a structure known as a follicle. So we'll talk about that fairly extensively here. Ovulation is the release of an egg. Ovum is singular for ova, so ovum is one egg. Ovulation is the release of an ovum from the ovary. To be clear, ovulation is not going this direction. The egg, really, I should have it drawn, being released from the top. Then it's going to move into the fallopian tube right here due to the action of these fimbriae, which are going to sweep the egg into the fallopian tube. For our purposes, that's not really important, but I just want to be clear on what ovulation is. Ovulation is the release of an egg from an ovary, and in reproductively mature females, which is roughly from 12 years old to 50 years old, and certainly there's a lot of variation within that, that's going to happen every 28 days. The female monthly cycle, which involves both the uterine cycle and menses and the ovarian cycle. Those cycles are going to happen every 28 days, but once again, it's highly variable. It could be as short as 20 days, it could be as long as 45 days, and it can be absent even in some females. So before we get into the development of the egg and this follicle, I want to highlight the hormones that we're going to be talking about. Gonadotropin releasing hormone is released from the hypothalamus. That's GnRH. Then we have follicle stimulating hormone that we abbreviate as FSH, and luteinizing hormone that we abbreviate as LH. Both of these hormones are released from the anterior pituitary. Once again, when the hypothalamus releases GnRH, it's going to travel through the bloodstream. Now, to be clear, GnRH is stimulating the release of FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary. And as you can see, the hypothalamus is immediately above the pituitary gland, but still GnRH needs to utilize the bloodstream to get to the pituitary gland to stimulate the release of FSH and LH. FSH and LH have a strong influence, or let me rephrase this, they're absolutely necessary for the production and release of estrogen. Estrogen is really the main female hormone. Males certainly produce estrogen, females produce testosterone, but the overwhelming majority of the female sex hormone is estrogen, specifically beta estradiol. There's 3 general types of estrogens: beta estradiol, estrone, and estriol. But beta estradiol is the most robust and powerful of these estrogens. Now, one thing I failed to mention when I was talking about hormones is that hormones are stored in secretory vesicles like we saw with insulin and like we see with neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are not hormones, but they're similar in the respect that they are released from cells and they are signaling molecules. Steroid-based hormones like estrogen or any of the hormones from the adrenal cortex need to be made on demand. The protein-based hormones and the polypeptide hormones can be made in advance and stored in the secretory vesicles and then stimulated to be released. The problem with steroid-based hormones, say like estrogen, if they're made ahead of time, because they are lipophilic, they love lipids, they can easily cross membranes, the membrane of the secretory vesicle or the membrane of the actual cell, anytime they want, because they're lipophilic. So they need to be made on demand so they're not released during unintended times. Okay, so the ovum develops within the structure called the follicle. To be clear, there's thousands of follicles within the ovary upon birth. And during sexual maturation, let's say 12, 13 years old, every month one of these follicles is going to start developing. An ovary cannot develop without the presence of FSH and LH. FSH and LH are not released in prepubescent females. But what happens here is that during puberty, monthly during puberty, every 28 days, we get release of GnRH, which stimulates the release of FSH and LH. So I'm going to draw one of these follicular cells like this, and that follicular cell is going to have receptors on it. So it's going to have receptors for FSH and LH, but FSH initially is going to have a greater impact. So these are going to be receptors for FSH. And as these follicles start developing, these are actually known as granulosa cells. As they start developing and as more FSH starts binding to these cells, they start releasing a fluid that is rich in estrogen, so an estrogen-rich fluid. So they're going to release estrogen, and I tend to abbreviate estrogen as a large E. Estrogen is going to stimulate more FSH receptors. So now we're going to get a cell. Now we're going to get a cell that looks something like this. And this positive feedback of increasing FSH receptors and increasing estrogen release is ultimately going to result in placing a lot of luteinizing hormone, LH, receptors within these granulosa cells. So these granulosa cells ended up looking like this. So what we have here is GnRH stimulates the release of FSH and LH. we continually get more and more FSH receptors. The FSH receptors produce or ultimately stimulate the release of this estrogen-rich secretion from the follicular cells right here. And the combination of increased levels of estrogen and increased levels of FSH are going to put more and more luteinizing hormone receptors within these granulosa cells. And once the luteinizing hormone spikes, that's going to cause ovulation, which is the release of an egg from the ovary. So that's just an example of one of many examples of the endocrine system as it applies to reproduction. Now, estrogen has a number of roles within the body and within the female body. It impacts the development of bone, and this is a long bone. It's a terrible drawing of a femur, but these red lines here represent the epiphyseal plates. And the epiphyseal plates, or I should say between the epiphyseal plates, is a long shaft of the bone known as the diaphysis that elongates during development. But once these epiphyseal plates fuse with the ends of the long bone, known as the epiphyses, growth stops. Estrogen, during puberty, there's a spike in estrogen release from females, and growth is going to stop with that spike in estrogen. Estrogen also plays a part in bone remodeling. That is to say, bone is constantly remodeled, but there is a bone cell known as an osteoclast. Osteoclast is a bone cell. It's more closely related to a blood cell known as a macrophage. These are phagocytic cells that break bone down. But estrogen inhibits osteoclastic activity. I'm not suggesting there's no osteoclastic activity in females, because there needs to be a certain degree of osteoclastic activity throughout our life because we're constantly rebuilding bone. But estrogen inhibits excessive osteoclastic activity. To be clear, reproductively mature females release high levels of estrogen. Postmenopausal women, that is to say after the age, let's say of 50, and once again that's variable, they no longer have high levels of estrogen. And because they no longer have high levels of estrogen, estrogen is no longer inhibiting osteoclastic activity. And this leads some women into developing osteoporosis, which is where bone starts breaking down. So some women take hormone replacement therapy to prevent that excessive osteoclastic activity. Let's talk a little bit more about GnRH, gonadotropic releasing hormone, released from the hypothalamus. GnRH is very important. It plays a huge part in sexual maturation in males and in females. GnRH is released in a pulsatile manner. That is to say, every couple hours, it's released for 10 to 15 minutes. Another couple hours pass, it's released for 10 to 15 minutes. It's not tonically or constantly released. It's released in a pulsatile manner. We release it now, and then a couple hours later, release some more. A couple hours later, release some more. If an individual does not have GnRH, they are not going to mature sexually. That is to say, their sexual organs, their gonads, their secondary sexual characteristics are not going to develop, at least at the rate that normal individuals develop. Now, to be sure, GnRH, if it is administered exogenously, to be clear, exogenously means from outside the body. So say a pharmaceutical is added to our body. Endogenous is from within the body. If GnRH is administered exogenously, continuously, that individual is not going to sexually mature. And what probably happens is there's downregulation of FSH and LH receptors in the anterior pituitary. I realize we're talking about GnRH, but as we know, GnRH is a tropic hormone that stimulates the release of FSH and LH. So if there is a child who's not sexually maturing, how do you want to administer exogenous GnRH? Correct, the answer is in a pulsatile fashion every couple hours for say 10 to 15 minutes. and then they will sexually mature. And one last thing I want to say about GnRH, it's also related to some treatments for breast cancer. There are breast cancers that are referred to as estrogen positive breast cancer. That is to say, the estrogen is actually stimulating tumor growth within the breast. And that seems somewhat antithetical because estrogen is a female hormone, and it really is one of the primary hormones that is helping develop those female sexual characteristics and sexual maturity, sexual reproduction, most things, dare I say everything, related to female physiology. But it's also implicated, unfortunately, in some breast cancers, estrogen positive breast cancers. High levels of estrogen will stimulate tumor growth. But one specific treatment for that is to administer exogenous GnRH, and not in a pulsatile manner. By administering it continuously at high levels, initially, that's probably going to release a bunch of FSH and LH, which is going to release a bunch of estrogen, which is going to stimulate more tumor growth. But fairly quickly, there's going to be downregulation of FSH and LH receptors in the anterior pituitary due to the continuous administration of GnRH. And due to the downregulation of FSH and LH receptors, then we don't get stimulation for the synthesis and release of estrogen. The last thing I want to say about estrogen is we talk about it being a female hormone. Is that an accurate depiction of or characterization of the hormone? Maybe, maybe not. But to be clear, estrogen and testosterone are very, very similar. And they actually derive from the same precursor molecule, which is an androgen. And androgens are described as being a male sex hormone. I'm not sure that's fair either. Androgens will develop into testosterone. But to be clear, in the presence of an enzyme known as aromatase, androgens get converted to estrogen. And that's exactly how estrogen is synthesized. So there's the beginning of our endocrinology lectures. We'll talk more or get more in depth within the hypothalamus and pituitary gland and other endocrine glands in the next video.